Welcome, welcome. We're back at it again with the Valley of St. Louis Master Craftsman Study Group. And this time we're going to be digging in to the meat and potatoes, really, of Albert Pike's lecture on the symbols of the Blue Lodge. And specifically, we're going to begin that dive with Lesson 1, the square and compasses. So before we go any further, just a couple quick reminders. Again, these lectures are overview, surface layer for your consideration as you prepare to participate in the Master Craftsman Study Group for Symbolic Lodge. Remember, you want to get all the material read before you listen to this as this recap hits. And you want to take time to consider it all over as we work through. I am going to have the book out a little bit more than normal as we flip through to kind of pick up a few things here, but I'd encourage you, at least for our purposes now, we're going to start on page 93 in the hard copy version of Esoterica. Get that book out. Go grab yourself a drink, maybe a snack. We'll get started here in just a few seconds as we kick things off. So we're digging in to our next lesson. Again, make sure you've read all the material before we go any further as we complete our journey in Master Craftsman Symbolic Lodge. This is the 5th lecture on this program. I would draw your attention to the fact that we will be exploring material today regarding the square and compasses, the weapons and blows of the assassins. So we'll break these apart lesson by lesson, kind of cover what the material addresses as it does in the text. And of course, the first lesson beginning on page 93 is going to be the compasses and the square. We of the secret knowledge do wrap ourselves in mystery to avoid the objurgation and importunity of those who convince that we cannot be philosophers unless we put our knowledge to some worldly use. That, of course, comes from a Rosicrucian in England writing his letter in Latin as he discusses his pursuit of knowledge. And of course, very early in this section, we're introduced to the symbol of a rebus, which is a naked human body with 2 heads, a male, a female head. Of course, there are other aspects and features to this. We see the various planet in terms of signs represented. We see a square and a compass. We see the sun, the moon. We see Mercury or Hermes, that balance point above them. We see some geometric patterns on the egg or the orb below them, numbers that appear to be 43. A lot of things going into this. And of course, rebus means twice a thing. The engraving we see in the text comes from the 1613 work by Basil Valentine or Basilius Valentinius. And in there, we, of course, talk in the text a little bit about this. We're going to come back to this image later. But in particular, it's noted that to the Hermetic philosophers, this idea of the rebus, or at least the concept, if not the image, represented the generative or creative power of deity and the productive capacity which existed in nature. And this is going to translate over to this idea of the square and compasses. The compasses and square, of course, are important symbols in Freemasonry, and they're central to a lot of different things. I mean, I can't harp on that too much. But Pike himself asked, what is in these implements that entitles them to be regarded as so important, to be referenced as great lights, to be referenced with such reverence as symbols? And Pike was very curious about this. He reaches out to the English Masonic scholar, Brother W.J. Hughes, as to their position and use in other countries, and specifically in England. And Brother Hughes informs him that the positions are the same in England, and inquiring to their origin. His response is that it's just a very old custom, just a very old practice. Of course, this doesn't suit Pike. He is not probably one of those Masons who would have taken well the statement, well, we've always done it this way. And so Pike tells us a little bit more of his discussions and his inquiries, and he brings up different thought processes and other things. He mentions, of course, that in the French rites, which you'll also see within the Scottish rite to some degree, there's a discussion of having passed from the square to the compasses. And that's an interesting statement in its symbolism, but also in its applications. And if we consider the application of the tools, the square, of course, is generally applied to level surfaces. Symbolically, we can tie that to the idea of the earth or material world. Of course, the earth once believed to be flat or level. The compasses draws spheres, spherical bodies, arcs, that type of thing. It's said to be a fit tool to draw the heavens and the skies. Of course, we also have tracing boards upon tracing boards that show outlines of where a candidate should proceed across a working floor of a lodge. And in some rites, the brother seems to be standing over maybe a grave or some type of thing like that. In others, he's standing over a path, and at one end of the path, maybe it's the square, the other the compasses, and he steps back and forth, leaving one to the other. We can see here in the context of what's discussed that perhaps stepping away from the square towards the compasses is symbolic of leaving the material world towards the spiritual, cleaving away those material restraints for the spiritual tasks ahead. Again, the compasses we can identify with the heavens, man's spiritual nature, the divine nature in man, the divine presence, perhaps. The square is earth, it is material, it is the terrestrial, and man's material nature. So both sides of that coin. Consider how they're placed on a volume of sacred law, perhaps, brethren, how they change and evolve through the passage of time, through our progressive science. And then think perhaps to that moment where in some rituals you're told that the compasses is placed in the master's fashion. I think you'll see some interesting symbolism there when we consider this idea of man's material nature, man's spiritual nature, the idea of a progressive science. Pike says that he was sure there's symbolism and meaning, and that we know what they mean, and we know what they meant long before they ever came into the keeping of Masonry. And I think that's a very interesting part. That's a very interesting piece, this idea that they've had a meaning since before they've ever come into our care. So continuing this discussion on the square and compasses, Pike takes us to this idea of the four forces. And he states that man is divided between four great forces, divided into two sets. The two sets have specific kind of functions and areas. Two of those four forces belong to the animal nature in man, two to the intellectual and spiritual nature. The intellectual and spiritual forces are moral sense and reason. And both moral sense and reason, Pike kind of leads us through this idea that they come from deity, they come from the divine, they are a divine gift. And he carries us forward with this discussion, talking about the thought of our preparation towards initiation and how does a candidate be prepared, if you will. What steps are taken, what actions occur. And specifically, of course, think back to your own candidate lecture, think to your own monitorial work. Pike himself talks about the condition of the candidate in preparation. Represents a man surrounded by barbarism, ignorance, subjugation, depriving him of his faculties, reducing those divine forces of moral sense and reason. Then we're brought to light three times over, and each time we behold the progressive lessons of the square and compass. He continues to talk in this idea of the divine portions of man overtaking those more animal, wherein the square itself, with its two legs, represents the animal appetites, the animal passions. The compasses represents moral sense and reason, its two arms, and they're gaining and overtaking his animalistic nature. So the square, again, the world, but also here those animal natures, the compass, the divine, but also those more innate, spiritually given forces like moral sense and reason, overcoming the animal senses, becoming closer to your purer self and away from those material things that hold us back. Pike then shifts his focus just to a bit to discuss the lesser lights as part of his discussion, and he talks about a lot of things with this. What you find in this text, and this is my personal opinion, is that Pike is somewhat like me on occasion when I'm speaking. If he sees a rabbit hole or he sees a content point that he thinks is intensely important, he will jump after it and go several pages on a trace about one point and then dial it back to the topic he was talking about. This isn't an explicit case of that, but to some degree you will see it occasionally where he's going to do that as we go through this material. The three lesser lights in this case representing the sun, moon, and master. Pike talks about the sun and moon to ancient Egyptians were equal to Osiris and Isis. And in that way, one represents deity and the other nature. Osiris, of course, as deity represents the divine will. Isis represents divine wisdom. And between them is Thoth, whom the Greeks called Hermes, the Romans Mercury. And Mercury, Thoth, Hermes, however you want to go with it, he's between divine will, divine wisdom. He represents that logos, the giver of all knowledge to men. Of course, is how he's described in different texts. And the problem, and of course, the propagation of Hermetic philosophy, things like that. In a religious sense and a sense of mythology, of course, Hermes is known to be the messenger of the gods, carrying forth that information. Of course, more on Hermes. Of course, we've talked a little bit about this statement before, but there is a discussion within the text about how is your master? Have you seen your master today? He is clothed in blue and gold. And Pike here relates this idea that Mercury is unseen in the sky, but revealed when in front of the sun. The master of the lodge, then, representing the divine word in a way, or the divine wisdom, divine word, the deity, is going to have that outflow there. And remember that the lodge in all this interplay represents the universe. So the three lesser lights, the sun representing the divine will, deity, the moon, divine wisdom, and the master, the divine logos, the word. Now that does shift a little bit with some other symbolism, some other considerations of the lesser lights. And you can see me kind of tripping up as I talk about that. But I think there's several layers to this consideration, several thought process. Of course, Pike's opinion on the master and the blue and gold clothing was not always agreed with. Mackey himself disagrees with Pike's interpretation of the master clothing situation and says it's a vain attempt to elevate the idea by attaching to it symbolism of gold and azure. No such thought entered into the minds of the illiterate operatives to whom the question and answer originated. So Mackey just kind of poking it right there, saying that it doesn't make sense, it doesn't stand on 2 feet. The second lesson we're going to discuss today in our examination is on the weapons and blows of the assassins. And this is going to take quite a bit of consideration, to be honest, as Pike took quite a bit of time to discuss it in its various facets, because he talks about the weapons and their attack. Again, for brothers, as you read through this is all material as is printed within the text, and I will reference it as such. So please keep that in mind as we go through it. Pike starts us off very clearly saying, I have never seen it hinted anywhere in print or ever heard it suggested orally that the weapons used by the assassins of Hiram the Master and the designation of the parts on the body in which the blows were inflicted were symbolical. Now, there is several other kind of commentary pieces to this. At one point, there was a discussion in an early ritual about the letter G being shown on the chest of the dead master, and that seems to antedate the Baltimore Convention. And of course, the letter G is not the same in Roman, Hebrew, English character. Illustrious Arturo de Hoyos, of course, believes that this was related to the impression left by the angle of a square, which would resemble the upper half of the Hebrew letter Gimel. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. A little sidetrack comment there. The assassins themselves, Pike kind of breaks down into different pieces. Jubala, Jubalo, Jubalum. He notes that the ends of their names are a, o, and as used, they are the masculine, feminine, and neuter ending of Latin nouns. They are not Hebrew names. And Pike calls this out specifically, saying that the names are the work of men with little knowledge, little fertility of invention, less originality, and no genius at all. And I do find that kind of humorous. He continues to go on with another one of his past master rants, as I've earlier hit in an earlier lecture, and he begins to poke holes all at the various facets of the Hiramic legend. He talks about men so ignorant they did not know the Hebrew method of time, and that low 12 and high 12 didn't exist in their timing structure. He talks about ships sailing from Phoenicia to Ethiopia, when according to him, at that time, there were no direct seacoast involved, at least on one side of that discussion. I'm not entirely sure of that claim. I think that one makes me scratch my head because I think both of them would have had seacoast. The idea that Hiram Abiff was a Christian surname like John Jones. That Masons of Judea were taught lessons in the subject of Grecian and Roman architecture. Now, he's not done. He keeps going. Pike continues to poke holes, saying that in a former degree, the senior warden at the temple had a book of 70,000 names and was unable to identify each upon being shown his mark. Of course, this could also be traced to work within the capitular masonry. He said that no one saw anything absurd in representing a single man as attempting to pull to a standing position by a grip, a corpse. He notes that the penalty of one of the assassins makes no sense, as there's no seacoast, and a portion of the Mediterranean, Palestine, or Phoenicia have no tides. Again, I'm not too sure on that in regards to the tides, but that is an interesting thing. He ends it saying, I looked to find something in the master's degree that entitled it to be called, as some may call itself, sublime, but he couldn't find anything. And he was strongly inclined to abandon masonry altogether. Thus, he kept his research up, and he proceeded on. Let's break apart the weapons and blows of the assassins. My faith in the value of Masonic symbolism had been rudely shaken at the very beginning, having a halter knotted around his neck. Again, bringing up that cable tow we talked about before, he's not going to let it die. No one could give me an explanation of it at all. And indeed, it did not ever, or seem ever to have occurred to some of those of who I asked light what had special signification. No one could tell me the length of a cable tow was, with symbolic meaning of the halter around his neck. And he continues this in the same way, complaining about the Master Mason degree, that there really isn't any explanation to his ideas, his questions, his concepts, his thoughts. So Pike breaks apart the different weapons and tools, and these are all covered within the lesson itself. Pike, of course, looks at the 24-inch gauge, and he's reminded that in Greek, cannon refers to a straight rod used for measurement, a carpenter's rule, as well as a rule of regulation or law of conduct. Of course, keep in mind at that time, Pike's time, as well as about 1,800 years prior, ecclesiastical law and the ecclesiastical law of the Roman Catholic Church was kind of a paramount thing in most of the world, and its law is canon law. Roman Catholicism being the primary faith, Pike made some connections there, whether you want to say they're his own or not. The discovery and connection by Pike led him to several wrong paths, but it did set him on a course of discovery and a course of analysis to his own thoughts. He developed the conclusion that the 24-inch gauge, or canon, is a symbol of church law or priesthood. Not a specific church, not a specific priesthood, but a church's law, religious priesthood. And he goes on to discuss the idea that religion should unite men together with loving kindness, when the priesthood did not care to remember that its only functions are to teach and persuade, and has become arrogant, intolerant, luxurious, corrupt, ambitious, cruel, as they do in all countries. It makes religion the prolific mother of dissension, persecution, war, murder, extermination. And Pike talks about this, and he talks about all these places around the world where the church over time greedily grabs for power, greedily takes freedoms away, and becomes an intolerant repressor of free opinion. Thus, he says, the 24-inch gauge, a rule of steel, becomes a symbol of the vindictive and cruel priesthood, and it smites the candidate on the throat where the organs of speech are. Consider that. Take some time to digest that thought and that process. The next weapon Pike breaks apart is, of course, the square, and he compares it to Roman despotism in the joining of religious and civil authority. Get it? Square, religious, civil authority coming together. And he talks about how despotism relentlessly crushes the great and noble, the high, the holy aspirations of the heart. And he talks about how when religion and civil authority come together, nothing generally positive ever happens. Of course, in the United States, we have separation of church and state, things like that, and he hearkens to that as proof of the good that comes from separating them rather than the negative opinions he gives. And of course, he ends it with this mindset that the senior warden, with the angle of a square of steel, the symbol of despotic power, especially that of imperial Rome, personified by Pilate and Herod, smites the candidate upon the body where the heart, the supposed seat of affection, is. Now, you notice he mentions Herod, Pilate, Rome. We'll come back to that later. But he's kind of giving a whole bunch of statements in a series of commentaries, and then he circles back to them in chunks. He ends, of course, talking with the setting maul, and he says, fickle as the wind, cruel as the sea, brutal as the hordes of African savages, the mob or populace is aptly symboled by the setting maul. It's a weapon of blind and frenzied brutality. It's not a sharp instrument. It's not a delicate instrument. It's blunt. And it represents the loss of intellect, reason being discarded. People are easily swayed in groups. You know, I used to have a teacher who would say, a person is smart, people are stupid. This idea that when a tyrant or a despot or misguided authority is in play, they can sway the crowd swiftly and change the whole pace of what's going on. Thus, the master with the setting maul, a fit symbol of brute force of the populace, smites the candidate on the forehead, the seat of thought. So, those three things, again, really quickly. The cannon, the 24-inch gauge, throat, free speech. The square is at the heart, a seat of affection. The setting maul is at the head, the seat of thought. Of course, it is worth noting, and Pike highlights this in other places, that some English ritual candidates fall on certain knees during the sequence of events, and the preparation is perhaps flipped for the candidate between ancient and modern ritual. So, having considered the tools of these assassins, Pike takes an interest in exploring the names of the assassins and a little bit about them. And by this time in Pike's life, he has expanded greatly on his interest in the Indo-Aryan religious faiths, Indo-Aryan people, the Hindu people. And so he has done a massive amount of scholarly work, including on the sacred monosyllable. It is a fantastic text he wrote on the sacred monosyllable. I would highly encourage you to pick up that book if you've not, or find a printed version or reprinted version. The Scottish Rite Research Society did a print of it several years ago, and it is Albert Pike's lectures on Masonic symbolism and a second lecture on symbolism. But he also has some of that material in it. That has the introductory material to this program, but he also does have a text on the sacred monosyllable itself. So, again, Pike exploring some of these Indo-Aryan thought processes. He begins to make a connection about the termination of the names of the assassins in relation to the sacred monosyllable, A-O-Om, as the ending of those names. And he communicates his thoughts about this theory to Albert Mackey, and Albert Mackey passes it on to another brother, Pearson, who writes about it in his book, Traditions of Masonry. But what were Pike's thoughts? Well, Pike first says that the Latin terminations in the order of what occurs is wrong. So something's got to be off, because the correct order would be OAUM. That's how we see it in the work, not as we would assume to see it if it was tied to the sacred monosyllable of AO. So Pike rolls in his mind again, and he goes to the Greek translations, or Greek itself, before he hits some Greek translations. Now, if we go to the assigned roles of the weapons and what they represent and the things they're connected with, that's where he ends up kind of hitting the hole in one for his thought process. The Greek word for the church, of course, the 24th gauge, canon law, misguided priesthood. The church is feminine, ecclesia, because the church is feminine in that text, ecclesia, thus A, right there. O, if we reference back to the representation of the Roman political scene, we see the emperor as a man, O being a male character there, and in Latin relates to the vulgus, or the Greek plethoros, meaning the multitude, mob, rabble, populace, are all showing the same meaning. Pike's doing a bit of reaching there, in my opinion, as he's pulling different translations and coverage to piece this together, but it is an interesting thought as he tries to line up some symbolism. So, again, what does his connections mean? He thought personally he had made a valuable discovery. He compared his discovery and its value to the idea that it was of great worth in regard to the idea of finding the name of a hated god in the sacred word of other degrees, here referencing the Holy Royal Arch and showing that the assassins are tied to a divine name. So he thought he had made a great discovery. He had problems with other connections with other names and other bodies where he said it made no sense. And so here, if it can work in one group, it can work in another. He goes on to say, in Jubal itself, I see nothing symbolic or significant. The letter J represents the original letter, which, as in Jehovah, is not J. Think Indiana Jones here, brethren. But it's I or Y. And Ubal, meaning a river or to flow. So that's an interesting idea, this to flow. I think, has some interesting significance when we think about what those men did in their own symbolic relationship to the master and things like that. Hiram itself, just a couple thoughts on him, the flip side of the coin. The Book of Kings tells us he was a worker in brass only. Comparatively, the Book of Kings is older than Chronicles. Chronicles tells us he's a worker in brass, but also other metals, in iron, stone, wood. He's an engraver. He works with linens. In Kings, his name is Kurum or Kurum. In Chronicles, Kurum. So just slight variations. Of course, Pike himself utilizes these spellings in the Ritual of the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite when we're talking about the 4th through 32nd, etc. He does not use Hiram really in any of those works. Hiram itself, as we continue in some of the thoughts and processes, he's spoken of in Chronicles as Kurum Abu, meaning Hiram, his father, probably more literally Hiram, son of Hiram. We know he's a working man. He's a servant. Perhaps he's even a slave, if you will, of the king, but he is, in a way, almost an equal, treated by both kings fairly well. And of course, with the two kings present and their own symbolism, we can, of course, determine that perhaps the kings represent wisdom and power of the deity. So thus, Hiram, the builder, constructing these things, represents the divine word or the utterance of that divine wisdom expressed into the world. Further, of course, there are some potential deeper symbolisms, or symbols, buried within this concept. Hiram's name in an analytical perspective can be broken apart. The Hebrew root as a verb, kur, means make whole or an opening. Pike notes that. In the sense of a noun, it's an opening window. It could also be white linen. The plural form means freeborn or nobles. Thus, we can make a symbolic meaning here of the manifestation of the divine light shining out or through a hole, an opening, an aperture, white light, white free something, knowledge, whatever you want to go with it, shining out. Of course, Hiram takes on a lot of different other representations. To early English Masons, Hiram was equated with the Christian sentiments of the craft at that time, and he symbolized Jesus Christ, the teacher of Nazareth. Of course, Christ is identified by John in his Gospels as the Word, which we would then symbolically identify with things like Hermes or the Master of the Lodge. Think to the Gospel of John, wherein we're reminded in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything that was not made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and darkness comprehended it not. Of course, there's also some discussion upon what Hiram symbolizes on the whole. He represents the enemy of those who have stood against free thought, free speech, free religion. He is the enemy of thinkers who endorsed those things that are against that. He stands for freedom in terms of civil, religious, political authority, and of course, what has stood against that in many ways, this idea of the despotic priesthood, where Hiram is a symbol of the thinker and the apostle. Pike compares Hiram to Socrates, Renzini, Sidney Russell, Roger Williams, Mino Sanarovella, as well as martyrs of liberty like Bruno, Galileo, etc. He really kind of spreads it around and says, he's the same as these guys in his sacrifices. Hiram, to us, in some, of course, you could say represents the divine word. He's free thought, free speech, free conscience. He's representative and symbolic, also the apostle of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Pike states that he believes, just in the mix of this, that Jesus, the teacher of Nazareth, did exist, and that the accounts are historically correct. But as to Pike's personal belief in him in relation to the divine, that's a concern of no one but Pike himself, and he states that. Thus, Brother Pike ties our side diversions up by discussing the weapons and blows as he completes his exam of Master Quorum in this lesson, and he takes it back to that Christian sentiment that we talked about earlier, and he relates the blows and the actions to the high priest to incite the crowd. So he talks very much in this idea of what each step of the assassins and their tools represented, in terms of if you were to apply it in a quote-unquote Christian sentiment, and through that lens. So he's talking, in regard to the idea that, first off, you have some of the priesthood upset with the teacher and wanting him silenced, being that first assassin. The second assassin is the church and state coming together, which is the push with Herod and Pilate. And then, of course, the high priest inciting the crowd as the third assassin. So, with that said, we close our second lesson. And we're going to take a bit of a jump all over the place in this next part, as was outlined for our consideration. And this is kind of all over the place, so I'm going to hit on these thoughts, kind of discuss through them, but this is part of the outlined reading for this section. So I would encourage you, just make sure you're kind of going through your text and keeping up with these parts. Specifically, you're going to find this parallels on the symbolism of the blue degrees, taking up a nice little chunk of the appendix. It's Appendix 1, beginning on 249. So, Pike talks a little bit about the Prince of Mercy degree. The Prince of Mercy degree deals with the Trinitarian Christian beliefs, the early Christian mystery systems, perhaps, and it relates to symbolism and connections that we've already just talked about. It presents more details than Pike talks about in his actual lecture discussing the weapons of the assassins. But Pike here within this degree kind of directly ties up and makes all those Christian connections out loud, since that is the backdrop to which this degree is set as we make our own contemplation and consideration. Additionally, our attention is drawn to Pike's use of various other sources, and one of those sources being Eliphas Levi, who Pike quotes as an unnamed adept. And we know Pike had his text. We know he had various forms of his text. Some of Pike's views in regards to those texts changed over time, but they reflect his early development and his processes as he changed his own perspectives. But he did utilize Levy's text a lot in Morals and Dogma, and some of it is found woven into some of his discussions on symbolism. In regarding the idea of Hiram and some of the ideas of Hiram's name, there is a discussion on the comparing of Kur, meaning sun or light, and linking it to Horus. Of course, we talked about some of the Egyptian thought process earlier with Osiris and Isis. Horus is also Hermes, the Mercury of the Greeks, and symbolized by the blazing star of the planet Mercury, we're told in the text. Pike then takes time to talk about how the workers were divided, the basic tale of the fellow crafts that we've heard before in regards to the Hiramic legend. So nothing crazy or new there within your scope. Further, and this again, all coming from the Inner Sanctuary Part 1, the Book of the Lodge of Perfection, but is included in our reading, the parallels to the symbolism of the blue degrees and the appendices. We have this discussion from Hiram, where he talks about responding to the interactions, of course, of the assailants. And he says, I did not sort of see the word that you demanded me. That's an important statement when we think about that degree. Attention is drawn to that. What significance do you find in that statement? It's kind of an interesting statement, obviously, but consider that on your own. In this variation of the ritual, Solomon sends 9 craftsmen to search. Weigh that with your own ritual work. And then finding the body. The brothers cry, Mak Benak, which means the flesh parts from the bone, or at least we're told that's what it means. Probably quite different. Now, again, Pike's weaving a lot of the Scottish Rite material into this, and this is a lot of material for you just to kind of consider interrelationships with the degrees and things like that. We're told the number 27, it pops up in the Lodge of Perfection as a number utilized for forming a Lodge of Perfection, but we're told specifically that when Hiram Abiff is buried, King Solomon sends 27 craftsmen in total over time to seek out his murderers. And of course, this story, all these accounts fall generally in line with the ancient accepted Scottish Rite variations of the ritual found in the 9th and 10th degrees, as well as the 3rd degree Master Mason. The rest of this material, again, like I said, is kind of choppy in its understanding, but we want to just make sure you're aware of it, as these are all points that pop up through the rest of the program in terms of the quiz for this section. There is some discussion, and it's worth noting the allegory that is behind and the symbolism layered behind the interactions of Hiram and the Hiramic legend. We're told that Solomon perhaps represents knowledge and supreme wisdom, as noted by Hokmah. The temple is a representation of the realization of truth and reason on earth. Kurum represents man, attaining understanding of the temple by knowledge and sagacity. The 3 degrees, the 3 gates of the temple, the 3 principal rays of light, the 3 forces of nature, we can take that and lay that upon the Kabbalistic tree of life and find several interesting considerations. But I would consider you take some time individually to think, reread through this material, read through these extracts, and consider what do you see as the symbolism. Again, there's a short digression with an excerpt of the Knight of the Sun, or the Prince Adept degree, which, of course, that degree in part also taps into those Christian concepts with the Hiramic legend again, relation to the idea of the 12 apostles, 12 fellow crafts. Looking at the legenda, the enigma of Hiram, which is the legenda, of the Lodge of Perfection. There's also a discussion on the symbolism of the weapons there. Pike here in his discussion addresses some of the thoughts we've already hit on, but he also takes a jab at Jeremy Ladd Cross and Thomas Smith Webb and the babblers of their school. And he's talking about itinerant lecturers. He's talking about the cycles of masonry at that time, wherein innovations have been made in the lecture, things have been kind of slipped through, and symbolism lost or confounded and just blown up to meet new needs that made no sense and didn't hit anything. We're going to kind of wrap this discussing just briefly Pike's dependency on other sources. So as you notice, we just blitzed through a bunch of different little things that are all in the appendices. These are all different little texts that they have excerpts of. Pike's work and his research, of course, is spread over multiple different ritual texts, multiple writings, multiple brothers, and outside the craft. We know that in sections like what we just went through, he was pulling things like the old 28th degree, the old 32nd degree. He was pulling material from Bernard's Light on Masonry, Richardson's Monitor of Freemasonry, the Ritual of Novices, those ritual exposés we already hit. All this material he's pulling from, he's making notes from. And of course, over time, some of this material is going to permeate in his revision work. And a lot of this deeper material is going to sift its way to the revisions of the 32nd degree, which first make its glaring appearance in the magnum opus of 1857. In particular, we already hit on him just for a moment, but one of the bigger sources he utilizes in things like Morals and Dogma, as well as some of the more esoteric bent angles here, was Eliphas Levi, or Alphonse Louis Constant. Was born 1810 to 1875. Levi was an occultist and ceremonial magician. He was at one point a Roman Catholic deacon, but he fell for a lady, decided he wanted to get married and do that type of thing, perhaps, and he resigned. He is known, of course, for producing some of the most influential occult esoteric works of the 19th century that to this day still have lasting effect. Pike, of course, was able to acquire some of this material in part here and there. And a couple of these texts addressed Masonic symbolism. But Pike himself never mentions Levi by name. Of course, we can tell the excerpts out pretty clearly, comparing them to other printed texts by Levi. But Pike does reference him as an adept or a great adept with reverence there. And he tells us, that the adept's explanations are arbitrary, yet they are nonetheless foundational to developing Pike's own ideas concerning the weapons and the blows. He continued, of course, Pike continues his study over time. From his initial thoughts on the weapons and blows, he frames them out more in the Legenda, which we saw some excerpts from. He frames them out more in the Legenda of the Lodge Perfection in general. And he builds on that. So as he flushes that out, he gets a stronger idea, stronger mindset of what is going on with these symbols. Brethren, I hope you enjoyed this lecture as we reviewed the material in section 5 of Master Craftsman Symbolic Lodge, as we kind of jumped about, touched on some things. Again, it is paramount you read this material before you listen to this lecture. Our big point with these are to acquaint you again with this material and draw your attention to specific things. So definitely you need to do the reading work first. So again, thank you from the Valley of St. Louis Master Craftsman Study Group for joining us. Hope you enjoyed this. Have a great evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're at in the day. We'll see you next time. Remember, Masonic education matters.